Good evening, YouTube. It has been some time, has it not? How you doing? Yeah, it's been a couple weeks since my last video. I've been living life. I've been working through the shame from that last video. That's an ongoing process, but I also have been busy. Like, I went back to Canada for a couple of days for a quick wedding. I'll never do that again. I told my family, I was like, this is the time I'm doing this. Like, don't expect me to be coming back for casual weekends ever again, really. But I'm so glad I went. Anyway, today's video are some things that I've been thinking about for a while, but really in the last week or so I've really been trying to like distill my thoughts and sit with these ideas a bit and work through them a little. And I actually took some notes, finally. I'm like getting better at preparing what I'm gonna say for these vlogs, so hopefully it won't be too rambly because I have kind of an idea of what I want to say. But before I get into that, I want to talk about what this video isn't, because I'm a member of the JET program, and I'm in some JET communities, or I am and have been a member of some JET communities online, and I've removed myself from a couple of them because they're a great source of support, and I think especially for new and incoming JETs, I think that they're invaluable, a lot of them. But I find that when you put too many JETs together in one place, digitally or like physically, like things get toxic, and I don't need to be in those spaces. I'm comfortable in my placement. I have my feet on the ground. My Japanese is barely passable, so I don't need that support, and with that I don't need the toxicity anymore. I don't need people like hating on the Japanese government and the Japanese education system. So that's not what this video is about. The title, as you can obviously see, is Uncomfortable Truths About Teaching English, and I'm talking specifically about teaching English in Japan to Japanese learners. But this is not a critique of the Japanese education system. This isn't a critique of Japanese learning culture. This is two things that I feel like are pretty unquestionable, and they aren't even specific to Japanese learners of a foreign language or foreign learners of the English language. I think these are pretty applicable to any language, but this is just my experience. So, without further ado, let's talk about it. Oh, also, with some further ado, I have these two Kit Kats. So this white one up here these are the new fall flavors. So this one is sweet potato flavor. Yeah, look at that focus. And the purple one is actually, well, you can't see it here, but it's actually, apple pie flavored, and it's already like exuding apple pie aroma, so I have a feeling it's gonna be like one of those like punch in the face of flavor. So whenever I need a second to check my notes, I'll be snacking on those. So now, without further ado, let's jump in. So, uncomfortable truth number 1. English is not a globally consistent language. I'm Canadian. We teach American English in our schools in Japan. The textbooks are based on American English. Many ALTs come from non-American countries. I at least have a similar accent to the people who are in the textbook, but a lot of my friends don't sound anything like the voices in the textbook. So when their students are learning, and their JTEs, their co-workers, their Japanese teachers, their accent is different. So students in class are potentially hearing two completely different pronunciations of the same word. So teaching a word like water might be a struggle. And that's just because English isn't a globally consistent language. There isn't standard English. There is like standard French or standard Japanese. Like, those are two examples of languages where like a central government has really made a push to have the whole country learn a specific version of the language. And obviously regional dialects still exist in any country, but when you go to school, you learn your language. And you do in an English-speaking country, but the English that I learned growing up isn't the same as like someone who's from Sydney. And neither of us are wrong. It's just that we are learning different Englishes, basically. So that comes up with like vocab we teach, with pronunciation, as I mentioned already, and the materials that we think of and we bring, like expressions that we use. I was teaching my students some pronunciation. We're working on their recitation contest right now, and the guy we're watching these videos by a British person, and he has extremely excellent diction and enunciation. But one of his videos that I was clicking through, because I was trying to find relevant videos for them, was like useful expressions. And the first one that he said was, "I'm not stuffed, I'm not bothered." And it's like, I'm not bothered, sure I might use that, but I've never used the expression, "I'm not stuffed." But he can teach them how to do a th and the so well. So well. Anyway, I'm getting off track, so American English is in the classrooms, but the British National Council, does a lot of work in Japan as well, and so they do a lot of like workshops and English camps and seminars and things like that, but they're teaching British English, and even at the JET orientation that we had in August, that we have every year, the British Council comes and they teach British English, which is like, obviously it's not a huge departure from American English, but it's not consistent. Like we're not coming from a consistent place to teach these students. So we're inherently creating conflict. But also it's like, if we're teaching students American English versus British English, what are we setting them up for? Like, are we setting them up to go to these places? Are we setting them up to talk to people from these places? Like, but I'll get to that more in my next point. First note check. So there's a choice between acknowledging this in class, that English isn't a consistent language, but I mean, you can spend as much time as you want, but you're gonna, I don't know, it's like finding a middle ground between being succinct and being quick about it, and really exploring the diversity of English is not really satisfying. Like I'll say like, oh well, you know, in the US we say it this way, but in Canada we say it this way. And it's like telling students, okay, like there's different ways that they exist. We're not going to tell you what they all are, but maybe when you see them you recognize it. Tastes like a sweet potato. At first. The sweet potato flavor fades quickly, and then just turns into like a white chocolate Kit Kat. 5 out of 10. Anyway, the last thing I want to talk about for First Truth is that English is, so it's not globally consistent, and it's always been regionally influenced. Like, we have tons of loan words and tons of expressions that I think we even take for granted. Like, RSVP, the acronym, is French for Répondez s'il vous plaît. And we don't even think about that. Like, if you ask the average English native speaker, what is RSVP? Like, yeah, people who are educated or whatever might say like, oh, you know, it's French, it's répondez s'il vous plaît, it's please respond. But a lot of people won't know that much. And that has some kind of interesting examples also in Japanese, where people take things for granted. Like, the word, what was the word I was thinking of? Like the word puro ures, which means pro wrestler. And I think that Japanese people, they can obviously, most people would pick out, oh yeah, it comes from English. What does puro ures mean? They might be like, oh, I don't know, it means puro ures. They might not be able to articulate or identify that it comes from the word professional wrestler. And that's just like the things that we take for granted in a language that make it harder to understand where that language is coming from. And then the last thing I want to talk about is no one English is correct. But there's a struggle as an English teacher whether to acknowledge a localization of a certain English word that people will use in a certain place, or be prescriptivistic and say, well, actually, this is how we say it. And another example I'm thinking of for this, that I've been thinking of, is social media. So in English we say social media, like, you know, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, whatever, social media. But in Japan, the commonly used term is SNS. And people will say SNS, which means social news sites. I believe that's what the acronym is for. But people won't say social news sites, they'll say SNS. So it's like, it is English, but it's a Japanese localized English. And like, so it makes sense. Like, people in Japan speaking English could say SNS to each other and understand. If they say social media, they might not understand each other. But if they're speaking to an English speaker and they say, oh, what SNS do you use? They're using English words. They're using English acronym, they're using an acronym based on English words, but it makes no sense to the English person because before I explained it, did you know what SNS stood for? Okay, so uncomfortable truth number 2. Translation is a game of trade-offs. You will always lose something in one way or another when you translate languages, especially ones that don't have a common origin. Like the Romantic languages and even the Indo-European languages, like those language families, you know, like you can do some amount of like jigging without really changing the meaning or the vocabulary or the grammar of a sentence too much. But with Japanese to English, you know, you have English it's a subject, verb, object language. I eat food. And then Japanese is a subject, object, verb. Watashi wa tabemono o tabemasu. Yeah, so like inherently, you're gonna have to change the grammar around, and that's a very, very basic example. But like, what I mean here is you can be succinct and you can get an idea across really quickly, or you can try to transliterate. And I'm gonna say that transliteration is garbage. We do not want to go for transliteration because that's how you come up with like the really, really bad Google translations of sentences. Or when you see, you know, the really bad English signs on stores because someone just ran a sentence through Google and just copied that without thinking. So that is garbage. But to get a bit more of a nuanced kind of version of this, for example, Japanese has been romanized in a few different ways throughout the years. So the kind of gold standard is Hepburn romanization. So that's where you will see the most common, as an English speaker, if you're watching this, you're probably an English speaker. So if you see Japanese words in English or in Latin characters, it's Hepburn romanization. So like, I don't know, like here's some examples of some words that I can put up. But if you are using kunreishiki, which is the Japanese made one, then it's going to be a little different. So the Hepburn romanization was made by some guy Hepburn, made by an English speaker. So the intention of that romanization is for English speakers or Romance language speakers to understand Japanese. But the kunreishiki is meant for Japanese speakers to produce their own language in Latin characters. So it's a debate between, is it the native speaker speaking or is it the English learner speaking, like using the language? And those are two different things, which can be incredibly frustrating sometimes because, so for example, the one that I see the most often, which is just appalling, is there's a bus company here called Kyushu Bus, and Kyushu is spelt like this in Hepburn romanization. But in the kunreishiki, it's spelt like this. Both of those are supposed to be pronounced and read as Kyushu. The first way is meant for foreign learners to understand and hear the phonics of the Japanese language. The second way is meant for Japanese people to produce Japanese in Roman characters. But it just looks so wrong, doesn't it? Doesn't it? Anyway, I guess this is a bit of a complaint on Japanese government or whoever, but anyway, where my gripe that is uncomfortable and maybe gets into complaining territory is that the Japanese government actually teaches both these things. So it teaches the kunreishiki and Hepburn romanization at different points in the education system. So in elementary school, students do learn kunreishiki a little bit. And junior high and senior high is where they learn Hepburn romanization. So if I'm gonna say there's one thing that should be changed, that's my one thing. That's my soapbox that I'll get on for a minute and say, like, be consistent. Because I don't see the advantage of teaching the kunreishiki still. But that bleeds into the other side of this uncomfortable truth, which is that really, we need to think about, like, what tools do we want our students to be equipped with? So, do we want them to have the tools that we give to a native English speaker, or do we want them to have the tools that they need as Japanese speakers who are learning English? So, like, the Kunri Shiki, as much as I hate it, its purpose isn't for me. So, like, should it still be taught? I don't know. I guess. I don't know. I need to think on this with my apple pie. Actually, you know what? I don't have an answer. I don't need an answer. These are just uncomfortable truths. This is where I have to sit with and kind of accept that I won't change this in my time in Japan. It is super apple pie. Like, not just apple. Not just apple. It's like the cinnamon spice. Like, crunch of the wafer is like a bit of that crust feel. And it doesn't fade like the sweet potato. It gets more appley. God, I don't know how they do it. I don't know how they do it. I'm sure it's like chock full of crazy weird chemical additives. Maybe some apple puree. It's just so tangy. Anyway. Students are not what tools are students being set up with, and that's not my decision to make. Obviously, it's my decision. My power is to help students with the tools and help them learn how to use these tools. So I mentioned this way earlier in the video, but it's like, are we using these tools for students to go abroad? Are we using these tools for students to speak to foreigners who come to Japan? And really, like, the government's educational goals for their population are up to them. Like, what do they want students to be able to do? Like, do they want students to be able to, like, go and live abroad if they have a population crisis back here and they need all of the workers they can get? That's how I'm gonna end this video. Thanks for watching. Yeah, so I hope you can be uncomfortable with me now, because it's a big messy world that we're living in, and realistically, like, what kinds of things do we want the world to be able to do? And I'm always going to be a believer in public education, like, whatever flaws it might have, I believe that in public education. However, the older I get and the more that I have worked in education systems, the more I kind of see the value in private education. I think I'd like to get into, like, tutoring or one-on-one teaching one day, because I think, you know, as much as I believe in public education, like, a population should all have a common level of some kind of awareness or knowledge on a certain topic, but also, like, I don't know, people are all different. We all have different educational needs and goals, and so, like, I think it's fair for people to want to explore that. I mean, I think a robust, excellent public education system would have all of those, but I don't know how feasible that is. So, anyway, like, comment, subscribe, talk to me about education if you want to. Catch you in the next video. Bye.